Welcome back, everyone. Today we will be reading chapters 9 and 10, so let's get into it. Chapter 9. Okay, he said. Okay. It's disappointing. He sat on the curb, elbows on his knees, staring up at the power lines and attempted to reason with himself. His scraped hands smarted and throbbed. It felt like late summer. For some reason, it was the power lines more than anything else that looked weird after 2 years in Fillory. That and the cars. They looked wrong, like animals. Angry alien animals. Julia was sitting on the grass, hugging her knees and rocking slightly. She looked worse off than he did. Quentin's heart was sinking out of his chest and out of his body and down into the dirt of this goddamned useless planet. I was king. I had a ship. I had a beautiful ship, my own ship. It was like somebody was trying to send him a message. If so, he got it. Message received. I get it, he said out loud. I hear you. I get it already. I am a king, he thought. Even in the real world, I'm still a king. Nothing can take that away. It's all right, he said. We're going to make this all right. It was an experiment in saying what he wanted to be true, to see if that would make it any truer. Julia was on all fours now. She heaved up something thin and bitter onto the grass. He went over and knelt beside her. You're going to be all right, he said. I don't feel well. We're going to fix this. You'll be all right. Stop saying that, she coughed, then spat on the lawn. You do not understand. I cannot be here. She paused to rummage for words. Hold on. Let's get this to focus a little bit better. There we go. That closer. Okay. She paused to rummage for words. I should not. I have to go. Tell me about it. I have to leave. Did the key think he wanted to go home? This wasn't his home. Quentin looked up at the house. There was no signs of life. He was relieved. He wasn't in the mood to talk to his parents right now. It was a fancy suburb with big houses that could even afford to have some lawn around them. A neighbor was peering out at them from her living room window. Hi, he waved. How's it going? The face disappeared. Its owner drew the curtain. Come on, he said to Julia. He breathed out decisively. Let's be brave. Let's go inside, get a shower, maybe change clothes. They were in full Fillorian drag, not inconspicuous. She didn't answer. He was fighting off panic. Jesus. It had taken him 22 years to get to Fillory the first time. How was he going to do it again now? He turned back to Julia, but she wasn't there. She was up and walking unsteadily down the wide, empty suburban roadway from him. She looked tiny in the middle of all that asphalt. That was another weird thing. Asphalt really wasn't like anything in nature. Hey, come on! He stood up and trotted after her. There's probably many Dove bars in the freezer. I cannot stay here. I can't either. I just don't know what to do about it. I am going back. How? She didn't answer. He caught up and they walked together in the fading light. It was quiet. Multicolored light from giant televisions flickered in the windows. When had TVs gotten that big? I only knew one way to get to Fillory, and that was the magic button, and Josh had that, last we saw. Maybe we can find him, or maybe Ember could summon us back. Other than that, I think we're kind of screwed. Julia was swearing. Her walk had a slight stagger to it. Whatever was wrong with her, this wasn't making it any better. He made a decision. We'll go to Breakbills, he said. Somebody there will help us. She didn't react. I know it's a long shot. I do not want to go to Breakbills. I know, Quentin said. I don't especially want to go there either, but it's safe. They'll feed us, and somebody there will have a line on some way to get us back. Privately, he doubted any of the faculty had a clue about getting around the multiverse. But they might know how to find Josh. Or Lovelady, the junk dealer who'd found the button in the first place. Julia stared fixedly ahead. For a minute, Quentin didn't think she was going to answer. I do not want to go, she said. But she stopped walking. A sparkly blue muscle car sat parked by itself at the curb, a snouty, low-slung vehicle with a turbo hood in front and a rear spoiler. Some rich douchebag's 16th birthday present. Julia looked around for a minute, then stepped onto the lawn where a landscaper had laid down a row of head-sized boulders. She picked one up like a medicine ball, hefting it surprisingly easily in her stick-thin arms, and half dropped it through the muscle car's driver's side window. Quentin didn't even have time to offer advice or an opinion, something along the lines of, "Don't throw the rock through the car window." It had already happened. It took 2 tries to get it all the way through. The safety glass starred and stretched before it gave way. The alarm was deafening in the suburban stillness, but incredibly, no lights came on in the house. Julia reached through the hole and deftly popped the door open. Then heaved the rock back out onto the asphalt and slid herself into the black vinyl bucket seat. "You've got to be kidding me," he said. She picked up a shard of glass and nicked the pad of her thumb with it. Whispering something under her breath, she jammed her bloody thumb tip up against the ignition. The alarm stopped. The car rumbled into life and the radio came on. Van Halen Pound Cake. She lifted up her ass and brushed the rest of the glass off the seat underneath her. "Get in," she said. "Sometimes you just have to do things." Quentin walked around to the other side. For form's sake, he really should have slid across the hood. And she peeled out before he even had the door closed. They drove away from his parents' block at speed. He couldn't believe nobody had called the police, but he didn't hear any sirens. It was either really good magic or very dumb luck. She didn't turn the Van Halen off or even down. The gray street poured along underneath them. It beat a carriage anyway. Julia rolled down what was left of the broken window so that it didn't look so broken. "How the hell did you do that?" he said. "You know about hot wiring?" she said. "That is not wiring. That is what we used to call it in the old days." "In what old days did you go around stealing cars? And who is we?" She didn't answer, just took a corner too fast so that the car heated over on its ridiculously too bouncy suspension. "That was a stop sign," Quentin said. "I still think we should go to Breakbills. We are going to Breakbills." "You changed your mind?" "It happens." Her thumb was still bleeding. She sucked it and wiped it on her pants. "Can you drive?" "No, I never learned." Julia swore. She turned up the radio. It was 4 hours from Chesterton to Breakbills, or as close as you could get to Breakbills by car. Julia did it in 3. They shot west across Massachusetts the long way, whipping along old New England interstates that had been cut through pine forests and blasted through low green hills, the sides of which showed bare red rock. The rock faces were slick with water from underground springs exposed by the blasting. The sun set. The car smelled of its owner's cigarette smoke. Everything was toxic and chemical and unnatural. The plastic walnut trim, the electric lights, the burning gasoline that was shoving them forward. This whole world was a processed petroleum product. Julia kept the radio on classic rock the whole way. It would be an exaggeration to say that she knew every single lyric to every single song that came on, but not by much. They crossed the Hudson River at Beacon, New York, and turned off the interstate onto a 2-lane local highway, winding and humped up with old frost heaves. Apart from Julia's singing, they didn't speak. Quentin was still trying to make sense of what had happened to them. It was too dark to make the trek to Breakbills tonight, so Julia showed him how to extract cash without a card from an ATM at a bug-swarmed gas station. They bought sunglasses for her to hide her weird eyes, and they spent the night separate rooms at a motel. Quentin mentally dared the clerk to say something about their clothes, but no dice. In the morning, Quentin took a genuine hot shower in an actual Western-style bathroom. Score 1 for reality. He stayed there till all the sea salt was finally out of his hair, even though the tub was made of plastic and there were spiders in the corners and it reeked of detergents and fresheners. By the time he cleaned up, checked out, and harvested a bona fide actual 16-ounce bottle of Coca-Cola from the vending machine, Julia was waiting for him, sitting on the hood of their car. She'd skipped the shower, but she'd doubled up on the Coke. The car spit gravel on its way out of the parking lot. "I thought you did not know where it was," she said. "That was what you told me when I asked you." "I told you that," Quentin said, "because it's true. I don't know where it is, but I think there's a way to find it. At least, I know someone who did it once." He meant Alice. She'd done it as a high school senior, so they ought to be able to manage it. Strange to think of it now. He was going to follow in her footsteps. "We'll have to walk a couple of miles through the woods," he said. "That does not bother me." "A vision spell should reveal it. It's veiled, but just to keep civilians out. There's an Anasazi spell, or Mon, maybe just a Mon reveal." "I know the Anasazi." "Okay, great. Then I'll let you know when." Quentin kept his tone carefully neutral. Nothing made Julia angrier than the feeling that she was being condescended to by a Breakbills graduate. At least she wasn't blaming him for getting them shunted back to Earth. Or probably she was, but she wasn't doing it out loud. It was a hot, late August morning. The air was saturated with bronze sunlight. A mile off, at the bottom of the valley, they caught glimpses of the huge blue Hudson River. They parked at a bend in the road. He got that it hurt her pride and maybe something even more vital to be dragged back to Breakbills begging for help. It didn't change the fact that it was their first and best possibly only option. He was not fucking staying on Earth. He wanted a quest. Now he had one. The quest was to get back to where he was when he started his goddamn quest. That ought to learn him, but good. Before they set off, Julia spent 15 minutes on a spell that she curtly informed him would cause the car to wait an hour and then drive itself back home to Chesterton. Quinn didn't see how that was even remotely possible, on any number of levels, but he kept his doubts to himself. If he'd thought to keep more of the glass, he could have at least fixed the window, but he hadn't. So, hard cheese on whoever's muscle car it was. He took $200 in 20s into the glove compartment. Then they drank the rest of the Coke and climbed over the sheet metal guardrail. These weren't recreational woods, meant to be hiked through and picnicked in. They hadn't been curated and made user-friendly by helpful park rangers. They were dense, and the light was dim, and walking through them wasn't fun. Quentin was constantly ducking his head, too late to avoid being slashed across the face by a branch. Every 5 minutes, he was convinced that he'd walked through a spider web, or he could never find the spider. But he could never find the spider. And he wasn't sure what would happen if they walked into the Brakebills' perimeter without knowing it. Nothing in theory, of course, but Quentin had watched Professor Sunderland lay down the barrier after the beast attacked. He'd seen some of the things she'd ground into those powders. Any second, they could be running smack into it. The idea made his face tingle. After half an hour, he called a halt. The woods were still. There was no sign of the school, but he felt it somewhere around here, as if it were hiding behind a tree, waiting to jump out at him. And he imagined he could feel older tracks running through the woods, too, like Alice's, poor cursed teenage Alice, wandering all night looking for the way in. It would have been better for her if she'd never found it. Careful what you hunt, lest you catch it. Let's try it here, he said. Julia launched into the Anasazi spell in her rough, fierce casting style, clearing invisible layers away from the air in a square in front of her, like wiping fog off a windshield. He winced inwardly to watch some of her upper hand positions, but it didn't make her castings any less forceful. Sometimes it seemed to make them more so. He began work on the Mon instead. It was a lot easier, but it wasn't a contest. Best to diversify. He never finished. He heard the usually imperturbable Julia squeak and skip a step backward. Suspended in the air in front of her, in the square she'd cleared, was a face. It belonged to an older man with a goatee wearing a royal blue tie and an appalling yellow blazer. It was Dean Fogg, the head of Brakebills. His face was in the square because he was standing right in front of Julia. "So," the dean said, drawing out the vowel until he practically burst into song, "the prodigal has returned." Not 5 minutes later, they were walking across the sea, which was as lush and green and immense as ever. It rolled out around them, the size of half a dozen football fields. The summer sun beat down on them from directly overhead. It was June here, inside the magic walls. It was incredible. Quentin hadn't been back here for 3 years, not since he'd gone to Fogg and asked to be stricken from the rolls of the magical world. But nothing had changed at all. The smells, the lawns, the trees, the kids. This place was like Shangri-La, forgotten by time, abiding in an eternal present. "We were watching you from when you left the road. The defenses go far beyond what we had in your day. Far beyond. Double-braided lines of force. We have a remarkable young man in our theoretical department. Even I don't understand half of what he does. You can see a map of the entire forest now in real time, showing anybody in it. It's even color-coded by their intentions and state of mind. Remarkable." Remarkable? Quentin felt shell-shocked. On his other side, Julia said nothing. God knew what she was feeling. He couldn't have guessed within 1,000 miles. She hadn't been here since her failed exam in high school. She hadn't spoken since Fogg had appeared, though she had managed to shake his hand when being introduced. Fogg rattled on about the school and the grounds and Quentin's classmates and all the impressive and respectable things they were up to. None of them seemed to have gotten themselves accidentally exiled to the wrong dimension. There was plenty of hot local news, too. Brakebills had become a force to be reckoned with on the international welter circuit, thanks to the efforts of one especially sporty young professor. One of the topiary animals, an elephant calf, had broken free of its hedge and was running amuck around the grounds, albeit very slowly at the rate of about a yard a day. The natural group was laboring mightily to corral it and bring it to justice, but no luck so far. The library was still plagued by outbreaks of flying books. 3 weeks ago, a whole flock of far eastern atlases had taken wing, terrifyingly broad, muscular volumes like albatrosses, and wrecked the circulation area, sending students crawling under tables. The books actually found their way out through the front door and roosted in a tree by the welter's board, from which they raucously heckled passerbys in a babble of languages until they got rained on and dragged themselves sulkily back to the stacks, where they were being aggressively rebound. All Quentin could think was how weird it was that all this was still going on. It shouldn't be possible. It must violate a law of physics. A few students dotted the grass, girls mostly, sunning their light-starved bodies to the extent that the school uniform would permit. Classes were out for the semester, but the seniors hadn't graduated yet. If Quentin were to turn left here and walk 5 minutes past the stand of live oaks, he'd get to the cottage, and it would be full of strangers lolling in the window seats, drinking the wine, reading the books, screwing each other in the beds. He'd wondered if he would want to see it, but now that he was here, he really didn't. The students watched the three of them pass, propped up on their elbows, full of lofty pity for those who had been stupid enough to graduate and get older. He knew how they felt. They felt like kings and queens. Enjoy it while it lasts. I wasn't sure we would ever see you again. Fogg was still talking. After your, what shall we call it, your retirement? Not many people who make that choice ever come back, you know. When we lose them forever. But you, I take it you saw the, how shall I put it, the error of your ways? Fogg had evidently decided to take the high road, and it certainly sounded like he was enjoying the view from up there. They left the burning expanse of the sea for the cool paths of the maze, which opened up at unexpected intervals into little squares and circles inside of which were nestled pale stone fountains. The same fountains he'd lounged around with Alice through the paths, though the paths were different. The maze would have been redrawn since his day, once a year every year. He followed Fogg's lead. I had a change of heart. The high road was wide enough for two. But it was very generous of you to accommodate me in my, what shall I call it, my hour of need, just as you say. Fogg removed a handkerchief from inside his lapel and patted his forehead with it. He did look older. The goatee was new, and it was mostly white. He's been here all this time, every day, doing what he'd always done. To other kids who then moved on and left. Quentin felt claustrophobic after only 5 minutes. Fogg still saw him as the boy he used to be, but that boy was gone. They walked into the house and up to Fogg's office before Quentin followed him inside. He turned to Julia. Do you want to just wait out here? Fine. Might be better tactically for me to do this man-to-man. Julia formed a mirthless okay sign with her thumb and forefinger. Great. She seated herself on the bench beside Fogg's door, the one usually reserved for naughty and or failing undergraduates. She'd be fine, he hoped. The dean sat down and clasped his hands in front of him on the desktop. The rich, leathery, familiar smells clawed at Quentin, trying to drag him back into the past. He wondered what he would say if he could talk to the boy he had been sitting in what looked like this exact same chair all those years ago, wearing the rumpled clothes that he'd slept in, joggling his knee with nerves, and trying to figure out if this was all a joke. Proceed with caution? Take the blue pill? Maybe something more practical? Don't sleep with Janet. Don't go touching strange keys. And what would his younger self say? He would look back at him the way Benedict looked at Quentin and say, like I would do that. So, Fogg said, what can I do for you? What brings you back to your humble alma mater? The problem was how to ask for help without giving away more than he should about Fillory. Its existence, its reality, was still a secret, and Fogg was the last person he wanted to know about it. If he found out, then everybody would hear about it, and next thing you know, it's the hot spot for Breakbill's kiddies on spring break, the Fort Lauderdale of the magical multiverse. But he had to start somewhere. Just pretend to be as ignorant as he was, or as he is. Dean Fogg, how much do you know about travel between worlds? A little. More theory than practice, of course, Fogg chuckled. Some years back, we had a student with an interest along those lines. Penny, I think his name was. Can't have been his real name. He was in my year. William was his real name. Yes, he and Melanie, Professor Vanderweeg, spent quite a bit of time working on that very subject. She's retired now, of course. What would be the nature of your interest exactly? Well, I always liked him, Quentin said, improvising haplessly. Penny, William. And I've been asking around, and nobody's seen him in a while. Since he got his hands bitten off by an insane godling. And I thought you might have had some idea about where he is. You thought he might have crossed over? Sure, why not? Yeah. Well, Fogg said. He stroked his goatee, mulling or appealing to mull. No, I can't go around handing out information about students left and right without their consent. It wouldn't be proper. I'm not asking for his cell number. I just thought you might have heard something. The springs of Fogg's chair squawked as he leaned forward. My dear boy, he said, I hear all sorts of things, but I can't repeat them. When I arranged for you to rescue yourself with that firm in Manhattan, you don't suppose I went around telling people where you'd ended up? I suppose not. But if you're really interested in Penny's whereabouts, I'd advise you to start your search in this reality. Dry chuckle. Rather than some other. Will you be staying for lunch? Julia was right. They shouldn't have come. Obviously, Fogg didn't know anything, and being around him wasn't good for Quentin. He could feel himself regressing in the direction of an adolescent tantrum. It was like trying to talk to his parents. He lost all perspective on who he was and how far he'd come. He really couldn't believe the awe in which he used to hold this man. The towering Gandalfian wizard he once cowered before had been swapped out and replaced with a smug, hidebound bureaucrat. I can't, but thanks, Dean Fogg. Quentin clapped his hands on his knees. Actually, I think we'd better be moving on. Before you do, Quentin. Fogg hadn't moved. I'd like to prolong this conversation a little further. I've heard some pretty exotic rumors about what you and your friends have been up to these past few years. The undergraduates talk about it. They're quite the campus legend, you know. Now, Quentin did stand up. Well, he said, kids, don't believe everything you hear. I assure you I don't. Fogg's eyes had regained their old flinty spark from somewhere. But a word of advice from your old dean, if I may. Notwithstanding my regrettable ignorance of interdimensional travel, I don't know what your interest in Penny might be, but I do know perfectly well that you never liked him. And no one's heard from him in years. No one's heard from Elliot Woge or Alice Quinn in years either. Or Janet Polchinski. Quentin noticed that Josh didn't figure in Fogg's memory. He should have asked about Josh first, though he probably would have gotten the same answer. And now you've turned up dressed very oddly, and you've brought a civilian onto the grounds, one of our rejections, if I'm not mistaken, which is, well, It's just not something we ordinarily tolerate. I don't know what you're mixed up in, but I've put myself out for you over the years quite a bit, and I have the reputation and the security of the school to think of. Uh-huh. There's the Fogg he used to know and fear. Not gone, he'd just been playing possum. But Quentin wasn't the naughty schoolboy he used to be. Oh, I do know that, Dean Fogg, believe me. Well, good. Don't go digging too deep, Quentin. Don't stir shit up. Fogg enunciated the obscenity crisply. Right now, you have the air of somebody who thinks he knows better. Humility is a useful quality in a magician, Quentin. Magic knows better, not you. Do you remember what I told you the night before you graduated? Magic isn't ours. I don't know whose it is, but we've got it on loan at best. It's like what poor Professor March used to say about the turtles. Don't bait them, Quentin. One world ought to be enough for anyone. Easy for you to say. You've only ever seen one. Thank you. I'll try to remember that. Fogg sighed tragically like Cassandra warning the Trojans, destined never to be heeded. Well, all right. Professor Geiger should be in the junior common room, if you need a portal. Unless you'd rather walk out the way you came. A portal would be great, thank you. Quentin stood up. By the way, that rejection sitting in the hall, she's a better magician than most of your students. Most of your faculty, too. Quentin walked with Julia down to the junior common room. He had to get out of here. Everything was smaller than he remembered it. It was like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And he drunk the magic tonic. He felt like his head was sticking out of the chimney, and his arm was out the window. Not going here? Not going here, he said. You didn't miss much. Really? Julia said. You did. Chapter 10. Julia was playing the long game, but the problem with the long game, it turned out, was that it was long. They knew she was out here, and sooner or later they would have to deal with her. All she had to do was wait them out. But meanwhile, weeks passed. People graduated, Julia included, probably, although she didn't go to the ceremony. The summer turned her darkened room into a convection oven, baking its contents to a hard hydropic crisp. And then fall came and the weather relented. The ivy that ran up the house in back of them changed color and ruffled in the wind, and rain spattered the window. She could feel the neighborhood empty out as her classmates all went off to college. She didn't. She was 18 now, a responsible adult. Her coming-of-age story was over. Nobody could make her do anything anymore. She could breathe easier with all her old friends. First, Julia's friends out of town, but at the same time it made her nervous. She was all alone on this one, very alone. She had made her way out to the edge of the world, hung by her fingers from the lip, and let go into freefall. Would she fall forever? Julia would do anything to make the time pass. She killed time, murdered it, massacred it, and hid the bodies. She threw her days in bunches onto the bonfire with both hands and watched them go up in fragrant smoke. It wasn't easy. Sometimes it felt like the hours had ground to a halt. They fought her as they passed, one after the other, like stubborn stools. Online Scrabble helped ease them on their way, and movies. But you could only watch the craft a finite number of times, and that number turned out to be about 3. And yes, all right, She did spend 6 weeks in an insane asylum. There, she said it. It was awful, but she knew it was probably coming, and you couldn't blame her parents. Not really. They gave her a choice, junior college or the Laughing Academy, and she picked door number 2. What could she say? She thought they were bluffing, and she called them on it. Read 'em and weep. So, that happened. Bad as she thought it was going to be, it was worse. 6 weeks of bad smells, bad food, and listening to her roommate, whose arms were crocheted with razor scars from cuff line to armpit, toss and turn and talk in her sleep about Transformers. Transformers. Everything is a transformer. Why don't they just transform? Who's crazy now? Those movies were even worse than The Craft. So she talked her shrinks in circles and took her meds, which helped to nudge the calendar along. Time sure flies when you're having fun, and by fun she meant Nardole. Sometimes she really did think death would be preferable, except she wasn't going to give those bastards the satisfaction. They couldn't wear her down. No, they couldn't. No, they couldn't. Eventually, she was simply returned to sender. The doctors couldn't keep her. She was no danger to herself or to others. She just wasn't that crazy. So that was another exclusive institution she's been kicked out of. But ching. Thanks very much. You've been a great audience. I'll be here all week, all month, all year, indefinitely, until further notice. Eventually, given that she had a little spare time on her hands, she opened up another front in the war. If magic was real, it stood to reason that some genuine information about how to work it must be in circulation. The Breakbills couldn't have it all to themselves. It was inevitable. Anybody who knew anything about information theory would know that. You just couldn't contain a body of data that large completely hermetically. There would be too much of it, and too many pores it could leak out through. She would start tunneling from her side of the wall. She began a systematic survey. It was good to give her always hungry brain something to chew on. It kept it, if not happy, then at least busy. She drew up a list of the major magical traditions, and the minor ones. She compiled bibliographies of the major texts for same. She then read every one in turn, centrifuging out the practical information and ditching all the rest. The matrix of useless mystical crap in which it was suspended. This required some leaving of the house, some fortuitous forays into the big blue room. But that had the extra effect of placating her parents a bit, so whatever, it's all good. She ground and boiled. She sniffed and daubed. It was fun, like a scavenger hunt. She hunted head shops and organic herb sections and familiarized herself with the restaurant supply stores on Bowery. A great source for cheap hardware. And online mail order laboratory supply houses. It was amazing what they would send you through the mail if you had a fake ID, a PayPal account, and a P.O. box. If this magic thing didn't pan out, she could definitely go into domestic terrorism. Once she spent a solid week trying like a thousand knots, tying like 1,000 knots in a piece of string before she read ahead and realized that the string was supposed to have a strand of her hair woven into it. And she had to do it all over. She had always been a workaholic. She just couldn't get enough of that workahol, was James's joke. But even she had her limits. Twice, she even killed something small, a mouse and a frog, quietly, in the backyard, under the cover of darkness. Hey, it was the circle of life. Hakuna Matata. Which, by the way, is a Swahili phrase of modern origin and does absolutely fuck all no matter how many times you chant it. In fact, everything did fuck all. It continued to do fuck all as she moved out of her parents' house to a studio apartment above a bagel store, which she had to temp to pay for. But it meant she had more space to lay out pentagrams, and her sister wouldn't steal her charms and bang on her door and run away whilst she was chanting, the fear effect having somewhat abated, unfortunately. It did fuck all even after she jacked off a simian 20-something who couldn't believe his luck in the bathroom at a party just because he said he could get her into the Prospect Park Zoo after hours. The zoo being like one-stop shopping for some of those African preparations, let me tell you. And besides, she needed some semen for a couple of things, though, unfortunately for the zookeeper, neither of them worked. One time, only once, did she ever get a whiff of something real. It didn't come out of a musty old codex, it came off the internet. Though it was ancient by online standards, the internet equivalent of a musty old codex bound in finest fetal calfskin. She'd been trolling through the archives of an old BBS run out of Kansas City in the mid-1980s. She was trying the usual search words, as one does, and getting the usual mountain of junk, as one does. It was like combing through stellar radiation for signs of extraterrestrial life, but one hit looked suspiciously like signal and not noise. It was an image file. In the bad old days of 2400 baud modems, image files had to be posted in hexadecimal code, in tranches of 10 or 20 parts, since the amount of data in an image was many times the allowable length for a single post. You saved all the files together in a folder and then used a little utility to zip them together into a single document and decode them. Half the time, a character or two got cut off along the way, and the entire frame got thrown off, and you ended up with nothing. Noise, static, snow crash. The other half of the time you wound up with a photograph of a 30-something stripper with baby fat and a cesarean scar, wearing only the bottom part of a high school cheerleader's uniform. But if she was going to crack the magic racket, it wasn't going to be by half measures. What this image was, once she had zipped and decoded it, was a scan of a handwritten document, a couplet, 2 lines of words in a language she didn't recognize, transcribed phonetically. Above each symbol was a musical staff indicating rhythm and, in a couple of cases, intonation. Below it was a drawing of a human hand performing a gesture. There was no indication of what the document was, no title or explanation, but it was interesting. It had a purposeful quality, draftsman-like and precise. It didn't look like an art project or a joke. Too much work and not enough funny. She practiced them separately first. Thank God for 10 years of oboe lessons, on the strength of which she could sight sing. The words were simple, but the hand positions were murder. Halfway through, she went back to thinking it was a joke, but she was too stubborn to quit. She would have even then, but as an experiment, she tried the first few syllables, and she discovered that something was different about this one. It made her fingertips feel hot. They buzzed like she'd touched a battery. The air resisted her, as if it had become slightly viscous. Something stirred in her chest and had never stirred there before. It had been sleeping her whole life, and now, somehow, by doing this, she had poked it, and it stirred. The effect went away as soon as she stopped. It was 2 a.m, and she had a word processing shift at a law firm in Manhattan at 8. Word processing was all she got anymore. She could type like a demon, but her appearance and phone manner had degenerated to the point where, at her last receptionist assignment, they'd shit-canned her on site. She hadn't showered or slept in 2 days or washed her sheets in 2 months. Her eyes were full of sand. She stood at her desk and tried it again. It was 2 more hours before she got all the way through it for the first time. The words were right, and the pitch, and the rhythm. The hand positions were still a joke, but she was onto something. This was not fuck all. When she stopped, her fingers left trails in the air. It was like a hallucination, the kind of optical effect you'd get from botched laser surgery, or maybe from staying up all night 2 nights in a row. She waved her hand, and it it left streaks of color across her vision. Red from her thumb, yellow, green, blue, and then purple from her pinky. She smelled that electric smell. It was Quentin's smell. Julia went up to the roof. She didn't want to touch anything with the spell going. It was like having fresh fingernail polish on, but she had to go somewhere. So she climbed the steel ladder and cracked the trap door and emerged out into the jungle of tar paper and air conditioners. She stood on the roof and made rainbow patterns with her hands against the rapidly blurring, pre-drawn sky until it stopped working. It was magic. Real magic. And she was doing it. Hakuna fucking Matata. Either she went crazy or she'd finally gone well and truly around the bend, and she wasn't coming back. Either way, she could have died for joy. Then she went downstairs and slept for an hour. When she woke up, she saw that her fingers had left multicolored stains on the sheets. Her chest felt painfully hollowed out, as if somebody had gone in and scraped out all the organs with a table knife, like scraping the pith out of a jack-o'-lantern. It wasn't until then that she thought to try to trace the posters from the BBS. But when she checked the archive, the post was already gone. But the spell still worked. She set it going again, and it worked again. Then, careful not to touch her face with her candy-colored fingers, she put her head down on her desk and sobbed like a child who'd been beaten. That's it for this week. Next week, we'll be reading Chapter 11.